Well, the first thing to ask is, can you hear me at the back? Which, of course, is a daft question, because if they can't hear you, they can't hear the question. But you can hear. Hooray. And the first thing to say is, thank you all, whether from Cambridge or further afield, for turning up to hear me at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. I confess, when I was a student, I wasn't very good at attending 9 o'clock lectures. I was reading law, and the lectures were meant to be compulsory. I did go to one or two. I remember attending one by a celebrated professor at Trinity called Glanville Williams. He was the country's great scholar on criminal law. He defined a crime as that which is followed by criminal proceedings. That may have been strictly true, but it didn't do much for me. Before the year was out, I changed to English, giving up a life of riches for one of happy penury. I've been thinking about definitions. It's a little surprising, I think, that history was first recorded as a word in England as late as 1482 as a formal record. The trouble is, the word has two meanings. It's both the past and a description of the past. The person who writes history or performs it is an interpreter, a filter, with his or her point of view. In most European languages, story and history are the same word. Quelle histoire might mean what an admirable history, but more likely, what a far-fetched yarn. History, in this sense, is a form of storytelling. Or, as Julian Barnes put it, history behaves like an energetic piglet. Greased up and let loose in a room, it makes a lot of noise and people try to capture it, but all too often it slips away. Only many do want to capture it, particularly governments. The subject I'm going to talk about is how nations constantly use the past to shape the way they see themselves. From the earliest times, those in power have drawn on battles they may have won, or successful hunting expeditions, or even courageous defeats, to glorify themselves and promulgate an idealized story. Britain has, for centuries, been occupied with creating comforting myths about its past, from Alfred the Great burning cakes, to King Arthur and his court, to Robin Hood and his merry men. Some of you may recall a famous sketch in the 1960s review Beyond the Fringe, called The After Myth of War, which had a sketch about the retreat from Dunkirk in 1940, and all the talk about the bravery of the ordinary Brit during the Blitz, as if the courage our grandparents displayed was of a different order to that of other nations under similar circumstances. Myths are important. We know that. Ernest Renan, the 19th century French historian, wrote that forgetfulness is essential in the creation of a nation. We need our heroes, even if we know that what comes down to us should be taken with a large pinch of salt. And there are limits to how much falsification or mythologizing people will tolerate. To name one, Napoleon's war bulletins were so demonstrably false that his soldiers rejoiced in the phrase, "to lie like a bulletin." Though we still accept a lot, and those in power will use the past to further their agendas. After the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington had regularly to attend dinners where the Prince Regent, later George IV, would tell the assembled company how he had led a cavalry charge at the famous battle. "Oh, isn't that right, Arthur?" he would shout down the table. A fuming Wellington would reply, "If your Highness says so, it must be true." A small lie, but when does rewriting the past cross a line and become dangerous? Here's Margaret Macmillan, who 60 years ago gave the Reith Lectures on the subject. Dictators perhaps because they know their own lives so well, have usually realized the power of history. Consequently, they've tried to rewrite, deny, or destroy the past. Robespierre in revolutionary France, or Pol Pot in 1970s Cambodia, each set out to start society from the beginning again. Robespierre's new calendar and Pol Pot's Year Zero were designed to erase the past and its suggestions that there were alternative ways of organizing society. The founder of China, the Qin Emperor, reportedly destroyed all the earlier histories, buried the scholars who might remember them, and wrote his own history. Mao went one better. He tried to destroy all memories and all artifacts that, by reminding the Chinese people of the past, might prevent him from remodeling them into the new communist men and women. End of Margaret Macmillan. So, we've been at it an awful long time. Eric Hobsbawm wrote, I think ironically, what makes a nation is the past. My contention is that today, the reshaping of history for political gain is out of control, and that it will be extremely difficult to recover from the distortions and censorship that are now the norm in many parts of the world. A few examples. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has recast history so that the country is presented as the innocent victim of Nazis and communists, ignoring the hard evidence that Hungary deported 400,000 Jews to German camps. In Poland, in 2020, its then leader, Andrzej Duda, marked the 40th anniversary of Solidarity by setting up exhibitions throughout the country, but scrubbed from the record any mention of Solidarity's founder leader and Poland's eventual one-time Prime Minister, Lech Walesa. The nationalist government also passed a law making it a crime to suggest that Poland bore any responsibility for Nazi atrocities committed on its soil. The law was framed as protecting Poland's reputation of unblemished national heroism, not as suppressing memories. El País, the leading Spanish newspaper, has referred to the criminalization of opinion. Returning to China. In November 2021, Xi Jinping issued a resolution to reassess the centennial history of the Communist Party, which would, in effect, lay down a new version that would appear in published works, especially textbooks. Events like the famine of 1959, which killed maybe 55 million people, and political purges, which killed 38 million, were minimized. This was the third time in the last 80 years that a Chinese leader has made a major speech to tell his people how his country's history had to be written. Mao did it in 1945, Deng in 1981. Quite simply, Xi sees competing narratives as destructively unpatriotic, so there mustn't be any. Today, government intrusion has to contend with the internet. So Xi has created a system face-savingly known as the Great Firewall of China, an elaborate network of filters that eliminates certain words and phrases, anything in short that the authorities don't like. Thus, no Google, YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. Beyond that, posts on WeChat, the country's main search engine, are disappearing in great chunks. This censorship can include individual histories. Many people have had their entire online existence erased, or historic events, mainly ones that didn't show China in a positive light, not just the '59 famine, but the great Sichuan earthquake of May 2008, which killed close to 70,000 people. How can a natural disaster be seen as political? Well, in China it can. Its internet is shrinking, the number of websites down more than a third over the last 6 years. The result is that Chinese collective memories and history are falling into a void. The result, as Anne Applebaum writes in her new book, Autocracy, Inc., sometimes the point isn't to make people believe a lie, it's to make people fear the liar. In South America, just one country as an example, every year on the last day of March, Brazilians take to the streets to commemorate the hundreds of citizens either killed or else disappeared during the dictatorship that ran from 1964 till 1985. But 5 years ago, the then president, Jair Bolsonaro, an open encourager of mass murder, ordered the nation's history to be rewritten to accord with his regime's reading of the past, that the dictatorship had been a good thing, just as it had been under the murderous juntas in Argentina. Luckily, he is defeated in the 2022 elections before he can have his way, but other South American rulers are looking on. What of India? There, its Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has set out to make the country a Hindu-first nation, one that's proud of its achievements, even if they never happened. A new series of prescribed books declare that India is the birthplace of the motor car, that its holy men invented television, and that stem cell research was inspired by the revered Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. These books, not just recommended, but made required reading, are both, at the very least, chauvinist, racist, and menacing. For instance, they proclaim that the true India incorporates 8 of its neighbors, 8, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. The books also teach that Indian Hindus are superior to the English in general as a nation, and to Negroes. One state, Gujarat, has distributed the textbooks to some 50,000 schools, Modi writing the foreword. Back in 1981, in Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie wrote of his home country, "We are a nation of forgetters." He went on, "Some legends make reality and become more useful than the facts." Well, you can see where I'm heading. And I've left out places like Turkey under Erdogan with his worship of the old Ottoman Empire, or what the new right-wing administration in Holland is planning. History is being treated as an arm of government more than ever before. 3 countries in particular prompt a new level of concern: Japan, Russia, and the United States. First, Japan, whose years of conquest reached their most contentious point when it seized the nationalist capital of China, Nanjing, between December 1937 and January 1938. Its troops massacred 40,000 Chinese civilians, 20,000 cases of rape during the first month of the occupation in Nanjing alone. There was more innumerable Asians forced to become sex slaves under the chilling euphemism comfort women, vivisections of the helpless, biological experiments on other prisoners as part of covert germ warfare research, aircraft raining infected fleas on Chinese settlements, the butcherous leveling of Manila, the Bataan Death March, and the Death Railway. It's a terrible list. In 1945, the occupying Allies instituted an education program to promote what had truly happened during the war. That December, newspapers were required to publish a powerful sequence of articles drafted by General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. And for 10 weeks, Japanese radio ran a serial called Now It Can Be Told. Many of the atrocities were made plain. When the American occupation ended in 1952, a clutch of historians still felt free to write about the war in all its aspects. But now they were outnumbered by former soldiers extolling the bravery of ordinary Japanese, leading to a surge of what became called, within and without Japan, victim consciousness. The early widespread measure of debate very soon dwindled into a minority interest, and not until 1970 were studies of Japanese wartime atrocities made widely available. Then came the backlash. Urged on by the increasingly nationalist government, historians began to question whether the Nanjing horror was not largely a myth, And in 1999, a textbook for school children was released by a government publishing house, vehemently justifying the wartime outrages. A leading figure behind the reshaped histories argued that past events were not a fixed tabulation. History, he wrote, is not just something that involves the discovery and interpretation of sources. It's also something that needs to be rewritten to fit in with the changing reality of the present. Another leading revisionist said he wanted, quote, to use history to transform the relationship between the state and the people. School textbooks became the central battleground. The Nanjing atrocity was not exactly denied, but was recast as a spring break party for the soldiers that got a little out of hand. Such a way of maltreating history may well foster the kind of patriotism, but at great cost. John Carey has written, one of history's most useful tasks is to bring home to us how keenly, honestly, and painfully past generations pursued aims that now seem to us wrong or disgraceful. That's not how Japan's governments have seen it. To this day, they have not prosecuted a single war criminal. There's been some pushback against this way of thinking. The Japan Times remarked, there's nothing wrong with fostering patriotic pride, but it should be for the wonders of Japanese art and literature, its pre-modern civilization, not for its 20th century nationalism. Japan is a democracy, in many ways a thriving one. There is still debate about the issues that continue to bedevil its wartime history, but the government is setting the agenda, helped by the Japanese sense of what constitutes polite discourse. And one thinks of Goethe's comment, patriotism corrupts history. When is it appropriate to appropriate? Well, let's move on to Russia. When it comes to Vladimir Putin, one isn't likely to mark his end-of-term report, could do better if he tried. He's a serial murderer, a power-drunk despot, and he's set upon rewriting accounts of the past to fit in with his ambitions. A bit of background is important here. A sidebar on Mikhail Gorbachev and what happened from 1985 on. Here's David Remnick in his book Lenin's Tomb. After some initial hesitation at the beginning of his time in power, Gorbachev had decreed that the time had come to fill in the blank spots of history. There could be no more rose-colored glasses, he said. The return of historical memory would be his most important decision, one that preceded all others, for without a full and ruthless assessment of the past, an admission of murder, repression, and bankruptcy, real change, much less democratic revolution, was impossible. The return of history to personal, intellectual, and political life was the start of the great reform of the 20th century. Russia got so close to that, one forgets. When Putin took over in 1999, he launched upon a wholesale reprogramming of Russian society to end those 30 years of openness. He knew how effective historical rhetoric could be, particularly if it played to popular nostalgia for the Soviet Union, the collapse of which was, for most Russians, a mutilation. Gorbachev was despised, just as Khrushchev had been in the 1970s. Stalin was, if not rehabilitated, then something pretty close. A new bust of him appeared in the Moscow Museum. 500 special silver coins were minted in his likeness. New textbooks describe his time in power, yes, a few unfortunate things, but as something to be proud of. We won the war. Uncle Joe was a good manager. In a poll conducted 4 years ago, 70% of the Russians surveyed said that Stalin had played an entirely or mostly positive role in their history. And those textbooks. In June 2007, as Putin continued to solidify his power over his 144 million people, he appeared on a nationally televised conference of high school teachers, growling about the confusion he saw in the way Soviet history was taught. One participant was talking about the many historians of Russia's past when Putin just butted in. Oh, they will write all right. You see, many textbooks are written by those who are paid in foreign grants, and naturally they are dancing the polka ordered by those who pay them. And to some problematic pages in our history, yes, we've had them, but what state hasn't? And we've had fewer of those pages than some other states, and ours weren't as horrible as those of some others. All sorts of things happen in the history of every state, and we can't allow ourselves to be saddled with guilt. 4 days after the conference, the Ministry of Education laid down precisely which textbooks were to be used in Russian schools. Jumping ahead a bit, in 2014, Putin made a speech, to quote one Russian critic, drenched in distorted history, even extolling the Crimean War, which Russia humiliatingly failed. Later that year, he criminalized any public deviation from the government line on the Second World War. Then there's what's been called monument propaganda, whereas the United States, where I now live, has been expressing national shame by tearing down monuments, 160 of them since 2015, Russia has gone the other way, putting them up. Even a 30-foot-high cenotaph to the man who invented the Kalashnikov automatic rifle, killer of 250,000 people a year. At this point, I should introduce a sinister protege of Putin's, Vladimir Medinsky, who in 2012 became Minister of Culture. When an émigré Russian historian dubbed him the master of historical lies and historical politics, he shot back, "People live according to myths, and the state must defend that." The year after his appointment, he co-authored a textbook covering the 20th century that provided a single narrative of Russia's history and made its adoption mandatory in schools. Clearly written in a hurry, it's full of mistakes of judgment and factual errors. Some are small. Khrushchev's memoirs appear under the bewildering subheading, Telegram of the General. Others are more significant, such as the omission of any of the reforms of the 1990s. The book was so unhistorical that academics tried to revoke Medinsky's doctorate, saying that his thesis was largely plagiarized. A government body quashed the attempt. It means that a single view of history, Putin's, is now the only one allowed. The diversity of textbooks is the great lie of our time, says Medinsky. Some of you may have watched the 8-part TV serial based on Patricia Highsmith's 1955 novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley. In it, the sociopath, Tom Ripley, gives this advice. Don't you just take the past and put it in a room in a basement and lock the door and never go in there? That's what I do. And that's what Putin and his accomplices have done. Last, America. The United States is not a dictatorship and may never be. What is extraordinary, though, is that at this moment, in a nation of 333 million, two competing versions of its history have divided the country. A large reason for this is the role played by the 1619 Project, which was undertaken in 2020, just as the Black Lives Matter protests swept the country and the police killed George Floyd. It's a landmark summary of the black experience in America, placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of African Americans in the center of the national narrative. The book reaches into every part of contemporary society, from politics, citizenship, music, diet, and traffic, to democracy itself. Its authors argue that white supremacy was and is endemic. This portrayal is called critical race theory. The project argues that the full origin story of the United States began not with the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, but the year before, with the landing in Virginia of the White Lion and its cargo of 20 enslaved Africans. Trump denounced it and instigated his 1776 curriculum, which called for patriotic education about American history, and treated the classic documents of American history as sacred, not to be questioned. The curriculum was quickly derided by serious historians, but gained traction among Trump's followers. 4% of American schools are currently teaching it, as of a survey released last week. Biden cancelled it on his first day as president. But this didn't stop critics of the 1619 project from queuing up to ban it. Republican lawmakers introduced bills in the Senate, and at least 5 state legislatures withheld funds from schools that used the project. The Florida Citizens Alliance has urged its governor to reject more than 70% of the textbooks it has reviewed because of what they say about race. The same state's legislature also passed the Stop Woke Act, forbidding instruction that could make someone feel guilty or ashamed about past actions by, quote, other members of the same race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin. A member of the Indiana State Textbook Committee, one Ada White, believed the Robin Hood was a communist and set about banning his inclusion in any book teaching pupils in her state. I don't know what's happened to her. In Idaho, where Donald Trump carries 63.9% of the 2020 vote, schools have been banned from teaching that the United States of America and the state of Iowa are fundamentally or systematically racist or sexist. Other states, usually Republican-leaning, are pushing similar laws, a dozen or more trying to ban or limit how the history of slavery and the pervasive effects of racism can be taught. Like time capsules, school books contain the truths and plain untruths that have been chosen for posterity. In the United States particularly, textbooks have become the lightning rods of American society. That last sentence is an insight from a best-selling study published back in 1979, America Revised by Francis Fitzgerald. A look at the way America teaches history. It's 45 years now, but what she says still holds true. Texas, for instance, has always been and remains the greatest holdout for teaching history through a political filter. It takes one back to 1945, when George Orwell complained, already there are countless people who would think it's scandalous to falsify a scientific textbook, but would see nothing wrong in falsifying a historical fact. Across the country, the principle behind this kind of textbook history is that the inclusion of unpleasant information constitutes bias, even if the information is true. The tendency has been to minimize violent confrontations of all sorts. Ever since the 1930s, history textbooks have maintained a consistent level of dullness. American history abroad, indeed economic history generally, has been a closed book. This is Fitzgerald's conclusion, quote, simply, the study of teaching methods carries with it the assumption that children can and should be manipulated. The textbook's naivety about child psychology is matched only by their lack of respect for history. Educationalists want to mold the character rather than the intellect of children. In August, 2 years ago, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, James Sweet, who's also president of the American Historical Association, wrote a column for the organization's news magazine, titling it, "Is History History?" His concern was the trend towards presentism, the habit of weighing the past against the social concerns and moral categories of the present. There was a national uproar. Sweet found himself an outcast and was forced to apologize publicly. That was the militant left on the attack. If Trump is elected again in November, be prepared for the militant right. History may indeed no longer be history. And here is J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, speaking in 2021 about what the new right should do. So much of what we want to do in this movement and in this country, I think, are fundamentally dependent on going through a set of very hostile institutions, specifically the universities, which control the knowledge in our society, which control what we call truth, and what we call falsity, that provides research that gives credibility to some of the most ridiculous ideas that exist in our country. And we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. That's the background for the kind of history now being taught in America and the current battle going on. An essay in the New York Review of Books, published in May last year, began by asking, have the divisions over how we recount our history ever been so deep? Another historian joined in. The idea that history is a project that's decided in the political arena is a recipe for disaster. America still needs a version of its origin story it can love. Among what is under attack, Parchemist events, and not just in America, but in many places throughout the world, is how history is recorded and how history is studied. A byproduct of this, plague really, is the wrecking of archives, libraries, research establishments, anywhere that houses evidence of alternative versions of the past. This isn't new, I'm afraid, as I've said. For instance, we have less than 20% of Greek classical writings, some of that the result of natural decay or displacement, some of accident or poor storage, but a lot through deliberate destruction. Emperor Augustus ordered the removal of the works of both Julius Caesar and Ovid from his libraries. Caligula banned Livy and Virgil. Mary Beard points out in one of her essays that libraries are a means of organizing knowledge, for sure, but also of controlling knowledge, restricting access to it. No surprise, she says, she doesn't mention the university library here, that many are built on the model of fortresses. And so it goes on through the centuries. Back in 1949, Harry Truman wrote, "The truth behind a president's actions can be found only in his papers, and every presidential paper is official." Yet during Donald Trump's presidency, he frequently deleted his own tweets, despite being warned that it was a crime to do so. He tore up documents at the end of meetings, so that, to take one example, no real record exists for 5 formal meetings he had with Putin during his first 2 years in office. What can we expect of the Trump papers? A government archivist gives this warning, quote, "What kind of record will we have other than what he dictates will be the record?" Further, if the president wanted to, he could pull together all the pieces of paper that he has in his office and have a bonfire with them. How many weeks away is November the 5th? To return to Russia, Putin has seen to it that his country's main archival source, Memorial, is now denounced as a terrorist organization and has closed it down. A similar fate has met Sakharov Center and the Gorbachev Foundation. All right, history is a dialogue between our time and the past. We recast history because new questions come up, new information is discovered. Is there such a thing as an objective account of past events? Objective history? There's a delightful conversation in Tom Stoppard's 1978 play, Night and Day, about the British news media and alternate realities, in which a seasoned reporter covering a civil war in Africa is earnestly defending his paper. I think it's modelled on the Sun. "It's not on any side stupid," he tells the reporter from a rival sheet. "It's an objective, fact-gathering operation." And his rival replies, "Yes, but is it objective for or objective against?" Back in 2016, I asked Eric Hobsbawm if he felt it possible to be objective as a historian. He just sat back and laughed. "Of course not," he said, "but I try to obey the rules." What if those rules are broken? What we know of past events is not all relative. Wittgenstein talked of the inherited background. We are the recipients of an accumulation, a coalescence of facts and opinions that form a huge bedrock of historical record. Hitler is dead. Abelard did love Eloise. Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election. One final problem beyond that, beyond what is being done with history. In many countries, fewer children are being taught the subject. Fewer postgrads are working on history PhDs. And for those with degrees, there are fewer jobs in academia or elsewhere. In the States, for the academic year 2018-19, students receiving degrees in history and related fields were down a third from 6 years before. In 2022, 40% of 8th graders, that's 13 to 14-year-olds, scored below basic marks in history. In Britain, 48% of 11 to 12-year-olds spend less than an hour a week studying history. And according to a recent Ofsted report, only 30% of pupils study the subject after the age of 14. It's just not seen as relevant, certainly not a good career option. In 2020, during the height of the Michael Gove, Simon Sharma attempt to make studying the past more attractive, Anthony Beaver admitted, "It seems that the teaching of history is treated by the educational establishment as a rough equivalent of the teaching of dead languages, an unnecessary luxury of a bygone age, and something the modern world no longer requires." The way dictators are having history rewritten seems to me, think back to Glanville Williams, a crime, although one unlikely to be followed by criminal proceedings. The more's the pity. Interest in the past is under attack, and we are fighting back with a much depleted army. Francis Bacon laid down, "Truth is the daughter of time, not of authority." I just hope she will come of age before it is too late. Thank you.